Well, good evening, and thank you, Patty. It was a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. It's nice to meet all of you. It's nice to be here. Everyone who's watching online, thank you for joining us this evening. I am excited to be here to talk about the Bible, to talk about the book of Joshua in particular, and what I thought I would do as a sort of an intro is give you an idea. I want to introduce you to myself by introducing you to the Ministry of Associates for Biblical Research, and sort of bring up that connection. So my current role at the Ministry of ABR is I'm the administrative director of the excavations at Biblical Shiloh. As you know from studying the Bible, this is a very significant site in biblical history and in archaeology. The tabernacle was there for 3 centuries. And so it's a very important excavation that we're doing. We excavated at a previous site that we identified as the Eye of Joshua 7 and 8, and we dug there for about 20 years. I've been with ABR about 15 years. I started as a volunteer, and sort of my role has morphed in a variety of ways over the last 15 years. But I'm very happy to be here. The book of Joshua is sort of in our wheelhouse, if you want to say it, of the ministry of ABR, and I'll tell you why that's the case in a second. So the ministry of ABR was founded in 1969 by a gentleman named David Livingston. Now, David passed away about 7 years ago. The short of it is he was a missionary in Korea and had made a stop, I suppose is how the story goes, in Israel to study the book of Joshua in a class, and they kept telling him that the Bible was wrong about what it describes in the chapters 7 and 8 of Joshua about the destruction and conquest of the city of Ai, or sometimes people call it Ai. And so David, being a staunch believer in the Bible, thought, well, there's got to be something wrong with these interpretations of the archaeology. And so he began to investigate the question of Ai and became what we call, we jokingly say, he was the eye doctor. And he got his PhD in archaeology. He's never intended to do that in his life. And so over time, the ministry did a lot of research related to the narrative of the conquest. This has been sort of at the center of our ministry really right from the beginning. And so when I have the opportunity to come out and speak about the book of Joshua, it's kind of a natural. So I do want to say thanks once again. So I want to give you a little bit of that background. We're located in Akron, Pennsylvania, which is actually near Ephrata in Lancaster County. Rather small ministry. The Lord has always kept us small, but our impact has been large, and He's done unusual things through our ministry to increase that impact. One of the things that He's done in recent years is partnered us with a local TV station. We have a show called Digging for Truth, and this is free. So we offer a lot of resources free, and this is one of them. This is one of our best resources for educating people about the Bible and why you can trust it. And so I'm the co-host of the show. My colleague Scott Lancer also hosts the show. If you're familiar or you live in the area, you'll probably recognize WBPH is the station that the show is on. And if you're interested in watching shows that have already been aired, and I'm going to talk more about these at the end a little bit, you just go to a search engine, type in Digging for Truth, YouTube, and our TV show comes up. It's all free. Once it airs on WBPH, then we put it up on YouTube, and hopefully for lots of people to watch. And so I'll be referring to some of the shows related to the book of Joshua because we can't cover everything in one night. There's so much to talk about when it comes to the book of Joshua. Now, Shiloh is also mentioned in the book of Joshua, and so I'm not here to talk about Shiloh tonight, but I do want to mention, in Joshua 18:1, it says after the Israelites had engaged in a series of conquests in the land, the whole assembly of the Israelites was gathered at Shiloh, and they set up the tent of meeting there, or the tabernacle was set up there. So obviously this is a very important site. We've been digging there since 2017. Last season, the excavation was canceled because of COVID. We're planning to go this summer, although that's somewhat tentative. We pushed the schedule down into the summer, into July and August, which is a horrible time to dig because it's so blazing hot in Israel, but that's what we're doing, so please pray for us. If you're interested in that, digshiloh.org is the email address, and you can check out our resources and so on. There's also episodes of Digging for Truth that we talk about Shiloh, so if that's an interest to you on your free time, have at it. There's tons of material to learn about. Now, our focus tonight is on the historical background of the book of Joshua. So when a few years ago, when I helped Patty's group out talking about the book of Joshua, we talked about the background, some of the historical material and this is where we mainly get from the world of archaeology. This is one of the key ways that archaeology helps us supplement our biblical studies, is background. There's a lot of events in the Bible that are happening around the time of the Bible, that the Bible does not record. It tells us what God intended to reveal, but there's other things going on in the ancient Near East which the Bible doesn't say or talk about. Cultural background, cultural practices, cities, people, places, countries, wars, treaties, and so on. All these things kind of help us to understand the background of the Bible better. Now, what I do like to always say is that God's revelation is sufficient on its own to accomplish its own purpose. God doesn't need archaeology to do anything. So we want to emphasize the fact that revelation on its own stands on its own, can be understood on its own, has its own authority. It doesn't need archaeology. But archaeology is a nice supplement. It is a minister. It is a servant to the sacred text. And that's the methodology that we use as we approach the relationship between the two. Now, if you know anything about archaeology and biblical studies, there's different ways that people compare the text to what's found in the ground. Some people see the authority of the archaeology as over the text because they don't see it as the Word of God, or equal to the text in terms of its authority. So those are bigger philosophical questions. We come from the standpoint, that I just described. Now, a little background. I believe we have a handout here with some chronology on it. Okay, we've got the Jericho handout and we've got a chronology handout. Now listen, I know that chronology will bore 9 out of 10 of you to death. But chronology is important. Just think about what would happen if your husband forgot your anniversary or your birthday, right? Or as the book of Galatians says, in the fullness of time, God sent his son, right? So chronology is sort of the backbone of history. We want to put events in a particular place. Where did they happen? Who participated in these events? But when did they happen? And so chronology gives that. So I'll be talking about chronology from here and there. And there's some terminology in your handout too. I'll try not to be overly technical with the archaeological language, but if I say something like late Bronze Age, you can just briefly look down at your handout and you'll know the general time period for that. So let me give you the larger framework as we see it of the biblical framework in terms of chronology. This is all anchored back to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and then the Bible has a chronology if you work backwards. So if you're digging in the archaeological record, you try to synchronize the dates with the Bible, and then you can assign BC dates to the biblical events. Okay? So working our way from Jacob's entry into Egypt in Exodus 12:40, the Exodus, the wilderness wanderings, the conquest takes about a little bit over 6 years, and then the Judges period, which is a very extended period of time. So this is sort of the backbone of what we're going to be working with. So we want to set the stage for this because we want to sort of put ourselves in the proper historical context as it relates to the book of Joshua. It's the idea we want to get into the right place at the right time. Now, so let me give you just a broad overview The region that the events of the Bible take place is typically called the ancient Near East. That's the term that's used to describe the broader world of the Bible. Now, on the map that I have up here, this is a depiction of Abraham's migration from Ur. And if you'll recall in the biblical account that he departs from there, but they stop in Haran. His father, Terah, goes with him. Now, it doesn't say this in the text, but presumably people have sort of speculated that perhaps Terah had some kind of health issue because he dies in Haran, as Stephen says in the book of Acts. And then they continue on from there, and they depart. Abraham departs at the age of 75 to go to Canaan. All right, so here's the broader picture. You can see Babylonia in the south. And this is called also the Fertile Crescent because this area that people live in looks like a crescent going around the Arabian desert, of which no one would dare to pass. So you would have to travel up through Mesopotamia, as Abraham did, and go around in a big half circle to get to Canaan. So it was a long trek for Abraham to do so. So we're back at 2100 BC, somewhere around that range, just to give you an idea of where we're at. Now, mentioned in one of the components of the promise to Abraham in Genesis 15 is this mention of the Amorites. And I'm going to tie that in now because you'll see mention of the Amorites in the book of Joshua. Well, you see in the biblical account, God refers to the Amorites. Now, he's going to use Israel as an instrument of judgment against the people living in Canaan. And here we see the beginnings of that. Their sin has not yet reached its full measure. So whatever it is that they're engaged in, their idolatry, their child sacrifice is a practice that they practiced in Canaan. You see mention of this throughout the biblical accounts. Their depravity had not reached the point where God decided to bring judgment upon them. And so the Amorites is the reference that's made here. And so you'll see that mentioned in the book of Joshua. We'll see Canaanites, Amorites, and a bunch of others. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I'm mentioning the Amorites because the biblical text is placing us into a context of history, not from the time of Abraham, but also down to the time of Joshua. Now, the Amorites had a kingdom that had developed around the city of Haran, which is where Abraham and his family settled temporarily until his father Terah died when Abraham was around 75 years old. And it had spread to the south and to the west and had influence in Syria and in Canaan. So when God is speaking to Abraham about the Amorites, this is in this historical context. And the Amorite kingdom waxed and waned over a period of centuries, but still had influence in the region all the way down to the time of Moses and Joshua. So this is important because here we have a historical reference that we can sort of look at outside the Bible and anchor it. It shows the accuracy of the biblical text. It's putting Abraham and what God is speaking to him in a particular era of history. And it fits very well. Okay, so that's sort of the broad picture of the Amorites. They're the first mention in Genesis 10, the table of nations after the flood. They are mentioned there, and they're the descendants of Canaan, who's the son of Ham, who is the son of Noah. Okay? And we're talking around 2000 BC or so. So this is very early in biblical history. The Amorites are also mentioned in various texts outside the Bible, Sumerian texts, which is southern Mesopotamia, Egyptian, and then Akkadian, which was a common language and culture during this time period. So very important. Now we're going to get closer to the time of Joshua. We're getting close to the book of Joshua. We're moving down. This is what I sometimes refer to as the forgotten conquest. We often think about Joshua entering the land, destroying Jericho, and all the events that happen after that. But actually, there's a series of military campaigns that take place while Moses is still alive over on the other side of the Jordan River. Okay? These are important because they're sort of setting the stage for what's about to happen in the time coming down after Moses' death. And these are Amorite kings that are mentioned and conquered by the Israelites under the leadership of Moses. So again, I call it the forgotten conquest. And these sites have been excavated, and this is Amorite, have been identified by archaeologists as Amorite. You can see it in the map here. So again, we're in a particular time of history. This background is very helpful to us to understand the Amorite kingdom, what their influence was. When the biblical authors make reference to them, they're not making this stuff up. And often, say on TV programs or in liberal publications and so on, you'll see a lot of people claim that these biblical accounts were written centuries after the time that they claim to have occurred. Well, in order for that to be true, people centuries later would have to have access to accurate historical information. Our argument would be they weren't written later. They were inspired by the Spirit, they're accurate, and they're recorded by eyewitnesses. Someone saw these events occur, and they were placed in that time and place in history. And the archaeology bears that out. An example of it is, again, the Amorites. So this gives you a little bit of a background. This is right before Joshua and the Israelites go into the promised land of Canaan. Okay, now another element of historical background, which I believe is extremely helpful to us, is the Egyptian context. So I'm going to give you a little bit of that to you as well. Now I'd like to mention here the great conquering pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Now, the 18th dynasty, different archaeologists and scholars, they assign different dynasty numbers to the kings of Egypt and assign them categories so they can organize them and know what the chronology is and all that. Now, this guy is Thutmoses III. And of course, you'll notice the last part of his name. There's a number of pharaohs that have this designation, Moses as the last half of their name. Now, one of the things that I find interesting about this is, believe it or not, well, maybe some of you have heard this, that a lot of people claim that Moses was not a real figure and he's this fictitious character that the people of Israel invented to sort of justify their political position in the land of Canaan and so on. There's all kinds of different theories. It's sort of a neo-Marxist view of history, if you will. It's interesting in the New Testament, you know, the book of Moses, the law of Moses is mentioned like 65 times. So in my view, as a Christian, I kind of look at it and go, well, you want to say that Moses didn't exist, tell it to Jesus and the apostles. You know, it's a little bit hard to sell to me if I believe in the authority of Christ and the apostles, these theories about Moses. And if you were going to invent a guy named Moses, you certainly wouldn't name him after an Egyptian name, would you? You would give him a good Israelite name, you know, like Jacob or Joshua or something like that. So he carries with him the very kind of thing that the Bible records. He was brought up in the Egyptian court, as Stephen mentions in his speech in Acts chapter 7, right? And so here we have Thutmoses III. He's the great conquering pharaoh of Egypt. And he was the greatest expander of the Egyptian dynasties in the history of Egypt. He was the pinnacle. And you'll note the dates are right around the time of Moses himself. He reigned for 54 years, and he went into Canaan and Syria on about 17 different military campaigns to expand Egypt's influence. So now the reason this is important, So this puts Moses in that context. So these are the dates for Thutmoses III, and he's on the throne when Moses goes into exile, when he murders the Egyptian. Recall that part of the account in Exodus, okay? So that's our context. Here he is. Here's a carving of him smiting his enemies. That's always the case with the pharaohs. The pharaohs were infallible. They were gods. Everything that's depicted about them shows them being great and wonderful and all that, because they believed that what they wrote down went with them into the afterlife. So they were real, and they did a lot of the things that they said, but a lot of it's exaggerated. Okay, so you have to pick through what they say. But here's a depiction of his campaign. He's smiting his enemies in the 22nd year of his campaign. Now, you'll note the date is about 40 years before the Exodus. Okay, so he's going into Canaan and sort of beating up Canaan and trying to take control over it before the Israelites are going to go into the land. So this is sort of the background here. The name rings on this relief here that were found in Egypt mention like 119 cities, and mentioned in them are the capital of Og, Og's capital, Ashtaroth, and Edrei, which the Israelites defeated on the other side of the Jordan River. So again, it puts us in a historical context. Just give you a little flavor of how accurate the biblical accounts are as we enter into this period. So it's important to know the Bible doesn't tell us anything about any of this. It doesn't tell us about Egypt's relationship with Canaan. But it's good to know that there's a relationship there. I've always viewed Thutmoses III conquest and beating up of Canaan as sort of a way of preparing for the Israelites to take the land. It made it easier for them to conquer the land because these kings had already endured the thumb of the Egyptian pharaoh, okay? And what they would do, the Egyptians, was they would leave the kings on the throne in these little city-states in Canaan, and then they would control them and collect tribute from them. So they were vassals. So they didn't just throw them out or execute them, they used them politically. A little bit like the Romans did with King Herod, right, the Herodian dynasty in the New Testament period. They didn't throw them out and necessarily always replace them. If they were willing partners, they used them. Then they collected tribute from them. And so this is how the thing functioned. As long as you bowed down to Pharaoh, he would take care of you. He'd make sure that, no foreign enemies would come in. And so there was a trade-off there, a political trade-off. And so this is the relationship that Egypt has with the kings in Canaan leading up to the period of the Exodus. Here's a great example. This cave, this tomb drawing shows people from Syria taking tribute to pay to Thutmoses III. And they would call the land of Canaan and Syria retinue. That was what the Egyptians called it. So it gives us a little idea of what the background is. So anytime retinue is mentioned, that's referring to Canaan. That's right in the context of what we're talking about in the book of Joshua. These are beautiful murals that have been preserved for 3,500 years. So it's really rather remarkable, the beauty of what's been preserved in Egypt. Of course, because the climate is the main reason why, but in the sovereignty of God, it's great for historical background. So this gives you a picture of sort of how this relationship worked between Egypt and Canaan. Here's another artifact that's interesting. This is really old. This is the first campaign ever that the Egyptians went into Canaan. And it mentions the town of Shechem, which, if you're familiar with your Old Testament narrative, Shechem is mentioned many, many times, 60 times in the Old Testament. This is the place where Jacob buys a plot of land, where Joseph's bones are taken up out of Egypt and buried at Shechem. So this is a very important biblical site, and it's mentioned in this Ku Sebek Stela, okay? So a pretty cool connection, shows the campaigns, shows the name of Shechem, connects us to the time, to the Bible sort of in a broad kind of way. And these kind of discoveries, there's hundreds and hundreds of discoveries that are similar to this, that give us these connections to the Bible. It's really rather remarkable. And so it also mentions the Amorites, I should add to that. They called them the Amu. That was what the Egyptians referred to them as. So again, historical context, background, the Amorites are mentioned in the Bible, and they're mentioned in this stela, which is from the 19th century BC. This is about 500 years before the conquest, so some more historical background. Now, I mentioned briefly here about the fact that Thutmoses III and the other pharaohs would often go into Canaan to try to control it, and Thutmoses III was the one who was able to do it most successfully. And we find the political structure of Canaan is this coalition of city-states, kings who ran sort of cities and the surrounding territory around them. So that's the exact description that you find in the book of Joshua, isn't it? If you read through the narrative, it particularly in Joshua 13, there is mention of the long list of kings that Joshua had conquered. And so this is historical material that we can look in the archaeological record and see, do these correlate with one another? Do we have evidence for this? Is this the political structure of Canaan during the time that Joshua entered the land, and does it fit what the biblical account describes? Do they match with each other? It's an eyewitness account. It's saying this is how Canaan is organized. Now let's see if we can find some evidence that's consistent with how the Bible records that. So further examples of this political structure are found as you read through the narrative of Joshua, you'll find the Anakites, the Hethites, the Jebusites. There's our friends, the Amorites, who we've already mentioned, right? And the Canaanites. Now, what you'll find as a general rule as you read through Joshua is they'll refer to people generally as the Canaanites. So the Anakites and the Jebusites are, broadly speaking, called the Canaanites at times. And other times, the biblical author is more specific. You also find that the Amorites are particularly mentioned as the group that's in the hill country. And this is the area that Joshua and the Israelites primarily conquer during the initial conquest. It's the mountains, it's called in the biblical text. The hills, sometimes you'll see. The rugged central part of the country that the Israelites conquer, okay? And so the Amorites are often the group that's mentioned in relation to the rugged hill country of Canaan. And sometimes the Canaanites, if they're more specific, the biblical author is, it's the coastal plain. So as the mountains fade away and you go out towards the Mediterranean Sea, the land goes lower down. It's called the Shephelah, and then it goes down to the plain and out to the sea. Sometimes the Canaanites are described as people who occupied this lower area. So, there's a variety of terms that are used. Again, I just want to emphasize, Canaanite is sort of the broad term that we often use to designate the people in the land. Okay? The account in Joshua 10 where Joshua defeats a coalition of 5 Amorite kings, right? He runs them down and executes all the kings in Joshua chapter 10. And they're listed there. And they're called the 5 kings of the Amorites. So again, this is giving us historical context that's extremely helpful to us. As I mentioned, this connotation is a dual connotation. It depends on how it's being used in the biblical text. So take note of that as you walk through your study. That will probably stand out to you now, and it'll get you thinking about that a little bit more. Now, I want to show you a discovery, a really fascinating discovery. One thing to note about the archaeology from Israel as a general rule, historically, archaeologists have not found that many written texts in Israel. In Mesopotamia and other places, there's been hundreds of thousands of tablets found, mostly political or business records that go back to 2500, even 3000 BC. In Israel, we don't find a lot of written records. And so a lot of times, as far as written texts go, we have to look at other places for information about Canaan outside the Bible. We don't have a lot of written text, but by the wonderful providence of God, we have this remarkable discovery that was found in the early 20th century in Middle Egypt called the Amarna Letters. So I'm going to describe those to you briefly here. They were written, as I mentioned, there's a relationship, an ongoing relationship between the Egyptians and the Canaanite kings running the city-states, okay? And so during the time, just about after the time of the death of Joshua, so this is the early Judges period on the brink of the end of Joshua into the Judges period, you have these letters from these Canaanite kings that are written to the Pharaoh, okay? And they were discovered in Egypt, in that place I just told you, Tel Amarna. This is the king who was on the throne for most of the period that the letters are addressed to. His name is Akhenaten. It's interesting because in the letters, the kings are writing to the Pharaoh. And some of them are complaining about this group of marauders who are running around the land, conquering towns, destroying things, fighting war, and causing problems in Canaan. And so the kings are writing to the Pharaoh saying, "Oh, great Pharaoh, you're the best. We love you. You are the God of gods, etc., etc. Please send help." There's these marauders running around the land. And in the text of the Amarna Letters, they're called the Apiru. Now, it's really fascinating for anybody who sort of holds a high view of the Bible. The etymology of this word is similar to Hebrew. The Hebrews, or the father of the Hebrews is Eber, who's in the genealogical line in Genesis chapter 11, in the post-flood period, from Shem all the way down to Abraham, Eber. Okay? So there seems to be some kind of linguistic connection in some kind of way to this group. Now, the term is used more broadly in the ancient Near East, so it can refer to you can call somebody an Apiru, and it's sort of a negative connotation. So there's some relationship here going on. The term can be used more broadly, but I tend to think that the similar nature of the name is too much of a coincidence. It was the perfect name to assign to the Israelites. They were coming into the land and causing all these problems. And if you remember, there's a lot of towns, as you read through the book of Joshua, that the Israelites could not conquer. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So while Joshua had taken control of the land, God says things like, "I have given you the land. It's yours. Seize it." But the actual continuing on of the conquest takes a great deal of time. As you know from the Judges period, they fall into these terrible cycles of oppression and apostasy and repentance, and oppression and apostasy and repentance, and so on. So they're dealing with the Canaanites on an ongoing basis for a couple centuries, and then the Philistines come along to make the situation more difficult for them. So that's sort of the broad picture. So Joshua conquers the land in one sense, but the job isn't done. It's an already not yet kind of tension that's happening there. It really isn't conquered until the time of David. David is the one who finally seizes full control over everything that was promised to the people of Israel. So it's a very interesting way that the biblical account unfolds for us. So the reason I'm mentioning all that is to put the Amarna Letters in the context of the early chapters of the book of Judges and the end of Joshua. They're very closely related to one another, and they're very important. So these letters, here's what they look like. They're baked tablets. They're written in a text called Akkadian. Akkadian language is like the Greek of the day, like English today. If any of you travel at all, most places in the world you go to, England, we're lucky we don't have to learn other language. English is the common tongue. If you go to Europe, you go to Israel, everybody speaks English. So it's the common tongue. Akkadian was the common tongue of the ancient world at this time. And these tablets, they would write on them, they would bake them, and then they would send them as a correspondence. These were the letters sent to the Pharaoh from the kings in Canaan complaining about the Apiru. 14th century BC, right around the early chapters of the book of Judges. Here's some more. Some estimates around 300 of them. Here's just a map of different sites that are mentioned in the letters, and we're going to make some comparisons with the book of Joshua in just a few moments. Now, one thing I want to mention here that's really fascinating, that should whet your palate a little bit, is now here's a scholar who's studied the Amarna Letters and studied the Apiru. Now, he doesn't believe the Bible. Okay, so he's studying the Apiru and the Amarna Letters and who the Apiru were in the ancient Near East. So here's what he says. They were semi-nomads in the process of settling down into cities or villages. That sounds familiar. Who came from the semi-desert zone and entered civilian regions as strangers. That sounds even more familiar. They were members of tightly knit tribal units whose allegiance was determined by kinship, the tribes of Israel, and who had their own system of law, the law of Moses. It's fascinating. They acted in large armed units which were not only engaged in plundering raids, but were also seizing for themselves towns and parts of the land under Egyptian rule. If it looks like a glove or a duck or whatever, I don't know. I'm mixing up my metaphors, aren't I? Okay, it looks like a duck. All right, we won't go any further. History shows that whenever one finds independent armed bands, they were always ethnically homogeneous. That means they were from the same ethnic background. Sounds like the Israelites. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better description of the people of Israel entering the land of Canaan in the early 14th century BC. From a scholar who doesn't believe the Bible. It's really remarkable. So that's a great, great description of who scholars think the Apiru were. Fits perfect with the Israelites and what they were doing at the time. Here's an example. Another particular example, I mentioned kings before. We just kind of take it for granted that that's what the Israelites called, that's what the book of Joshua calls the leaders in Canaan of these city-states. It calls them kings. The king of Hatzor, the king of Ai, the king of Jericho, and so on. The king of Gezer, the king of Jerusalem. Well, that's exactly what they're called in the Amarna Letters. They refer to them as kings, king or kings. So it's found in the book of Judges, of course, and so on. So again, it places the historical context, the title, even though king is a very generic title, nonetheless, it does show there's an accuracy to the biblical text in the context of this period of time. The Amarna Letters, really one of my favorite discoveries. And again, this is in the early period. I want to reemphasize, in the early Judges period, the bridge between Judges and Joshua. Another thing that's interesting you'll find in the Amarna Letters is cities that the Bible, the book of Joshua or early Judges, explicitly says that the Israelites destroyed or took hold of are not mentioned in the letters. Now that's significant because this is the early Judges period. The king, if he has control over his city, he's writing to the Pharaoh and saying, send help. The cities that Joshua definitively destroyed or controlled, there's no letters from. So that shows the king wasn't in control of the town anymore, the Israelites were. And therefore, there would be no letter coming from Canaan to the king in Egypt. Make sense? All right, now we have the flip side. We also have a list in the book of Joshua of cities that the Israelites were not able to fully take control over. And they're mentioned throughout the text of the book of Joshua and in early Judges. Gezer, Jerusalem. Remember, in the biblical account, the king of Jerusalem is killed, but the text never says that the city is taken. And that's important because in Judges chapter 1, it indicates the Jebusites were still in Jerusalem. So a very detailed aspect of the biblical account. The king is killed, but the text never says that the city of Jerusalem is taken by Joshua and the Israelites. Bethshan, Ashkelon, Tanakh, Megiddo, and Sidon. So these cities are all mentioned in the book of Judges or Joshua, and they're all found in the Amarna Letters. And so, well, that makes sense. The Israelites did not conquer these towns, and the king from these towns sent letters to the Pharaoh saying, send chariots, send soldiers, I need help. So-and-so over in this city next to me has collaborated with the Apiru. He's a traitor to you. We need to get rid of him. All this kind of stuff going on in these letters. So, and you can see, backstabbing each other, typical political kind of stuff going on. They're under threat. They want the Pharaoh to come and save them. All right? So let me give you what I think is a really fascinating, I stumbled across this 4 or 5 years ago and in one paper that I read, and I had never seen anybody else mention it. So I want to mention it to you just to show you how specific the biblical accounts are in terms of they're describing what's taking place at this time. So if you'll follow me. All right, on your map, if you want to find Jerusalem on a map, find the Dead Sea and turn left. Okay? The top of the Dead Sea, turn left. There's Jerusalem. So over on the right in the map is the Dead Sea, there's Jerusalem. Okay, you follow me so far? As you move to the left on the map, you see the hill country. Okay, that's the territories that Joshua primarily conquered in the initial conquest. Then as you move to the west further, it fades into what's called the Shephelah and down into the coastal plain and over to the Mediterranean Sea. So The book of Judges and Joshua 16 mention that the Israelites were not able to dislodge the Canaanites from Gezer. Okay, and that's a town located right there above. You'll see that in the text, okay? Or, excuse me, on the map. So, they couldn't get the king of Gezer out of Gezer. They couldn't dislodge him from the town. Now, in the Amarna Letters, it's fascinating. The king writes to the Pharaoh, and he says, "There is war against me from the mountains." And that's exactly the area that the Israelites have taken control over. The Bible also tells us that the king had not been dislodged from Gezer. So it makes sense. He's writing a letter to the Pharaoh, send help. There's war against me. Perfect description of exactly what's taking place in the book of Joshua. So it goes on. He says, "Save my land from the power, save your land, Pharaoh, O great one. The war is severe. The Apiru are stronger than we." Here's a great case of, in this case, he rats out his own brother. His brother has pledged himself to the Apiru. So, he just didn't rat out his neighbor, he ratted out his own kin to the Pharaoh. We don't know what happened to his poor brother, but we can only imagine, right? Okay. Now, what's fascinating to me is not only this detail that we found so far, but in Joshua 16 and 17, it says that the Israelites subjected the Canaanites in Gezer to forced labor. So somehow they were able to capture people that lived in Gezer, but they didn't capture the city. Okay, that makes sense. The king says in one of the letters that he can ransom his people from the mountains for 30 shekels of silver. So put the two of them together. The Israelites are capturing people and using them for forced labor. They're from Gezer. The king is complaining to the to the Pharaoh about these people called the Apiru. And he says, "I can buy them back for 30 shekels of silver." This is a perfect description of what's happening in the biblical account. Something that's kind of mentioned in passing. I mean, if you're reading through the text and you're saying, well, there's this forced labor situation going on, but it's not really expanded upon, as far as I can tell. It's really a small detail in the account. And then yet here in the Amarna Letters, apparently the king was able to bargain with the Israelites to get people released for money, for the right price. And he's telling the king, the Pharaoh in Egypt, this is what's going on. So it all fits very nicely together. And it's one of those examples of a very, very minute detail in the biblical text that is affirmed by archaeology. It's not like a big discovery, like, we found an inscription that says King David on it, right? That's more exciting because it's King David, right? But here we have a detail of the account, and it puts the eyewitness nature of the account right in this context of history. This is Joshua, probably who wrote Joshua, right? Or someone very close to him, recording this very small detail in the account. So I thought my strategy would be, as I thought about how to approach this with you, it's kind of like a fire hose, the amount of information that we have that we believe affirms the accounts in the book of Joshua. And there's a lot of details in the account, a lot of historical information, a lot of geography, especially when you read through the areas of the accounts where the tribal allotments take place. It's kind of, I almost hate to say it, it's a little boring in the sense of, if you're not looking at a map, it's hard to follow where are all these places that are being mentioned in the biblical text. Now, obviously, it's revelation, and so God revealed it and preserved it, so it is important. So we want to look for its importance. But what's remarkable about it is the detail of the geography of the land, and that's another aspect of the accuracy of the biblical account. The very detailed, precise descriptions of geography in the land of Canaan, that when you go there today, there it is. You can see this is where the territory between Ephraim and Benjamin, probably this is the boundary line. or wherever it is that's being described in the biblical text. So when you put the archaeology and the geography together, it's really a beautiful thing, because you can see that this is not mythology. This isn't just, like the Book of Mormon, where cities are just invented that never existed. The biblical accounts are dripping with historical information. They're happening in the context of history. God is redeeming his people in space and in time. And in a way, we can be careful how I say this, because we're dealing with God's word. We can put God's word to the test. Now, there's two ways to do that, is with the skeptical heart or the heart of faith. If you do it with a heart of faith, you're doing it because God is drawing you into trusting him further. You're reading the biblical account. Ultimately, we're studying this because we want to trust what he has said and done in history, obviously culminating in the gospel, right? These events are shadows of the things to come, as the New Testament tells us, right? But they're happening in real space and time. And so this background material, I find it to be encouraging in the sense of, how does this apply to my life living every day? I'm dealing with sickness, I'm dealing with strife, I'm dealing with COVID, I'm dealing with prodigal son, I'm dealing with difficult relationships, and on and on and on and on and on, all the problems that we have, right? And they're real. It's about trust. So when God has spoken, when he speaks in the New Testament, all the promises that he gives us, that also extends to the Old. And when we find the fulfillment or the accuracy of what God has said, it just builds in us this sort of sense that, no, it looks like everything is falling apart. When God speaks and promises, nothing will ever change that. And that's a way to apply some of this. Now, some of you may have interest because it's historical. You like history, you like archaeology, or you like studying that sort of thing. But for others, it may be, well, how do I connect these two up? And I hope that what I just described is a way to connect it up if history is not your thing, if you want to say it that way. At ABR, we're kind of geeks. We do archaeology in the Bible and history, and sometimes, we love getting into the minutia on that, and all that kind of thing. But we don't want to lose sight of what the purpose of this is, and that is to inculcate confidence in the people of God and the sincere seeker that the Word of God can be trusted. And so in the background that I've given here, just a few points, right? We looked at the Amorite kingdom, fits the time of Abraham and all the way down to the time of Moses and Joshua. It gives you a big picture of the background. Now you know who the Amorites are. So when you read the Amorites in the biblical text, maybe it'll have a little different sort of flavor for you, different understanding. The conquest of Thutmoses III, sort of giving you a background, the Egyptian background, the relationship between Canaan and Egypt, the political structure of Canaan. Now we're getting down into Joshua some more, some real detail of the biblical accounts, and the Amarna Letters. You saw in there the intricate way that the accounts are woven into real historical events. And so that's sort of my objective in giving you this. I hope it wasn't too much of a fire hose. I do want to give you, in addition to this, just a few moments of some resources that are available. These are also for free, okay? So, if you'll indulge me, over here on the right during our break, or my right, or your left, is our quarterly magazine, Bible and Spade. Each family is free to take one copy as long as you sign up for our electronic newsletter, so it's technically not free. I promise we only send out information once a month. We will not spam you. We will not sell your information to anybody, all that. So if you'd like a copy, feel free to take one per family, and you just sign up for the newsletter. And then on top of that, I have some more free stuff for you. This is truly free. No strings attached. I gave you a small string with the magazine. But here we have some episodes of Digging for Truth that I can't get into this today because of time constraints. But first, you'll see a mention of Mount Ebal. Remember the Mount of Curse and Blessing? Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal. Okay? The biblical text says that Joshua built an altar there. And This is in a very highly disputed and dangerous territory in Israel today, but we have been able to have some inroads with some people internally in Israel where we've been able to do some research with an altar that's been found there. And there's evidence that seems to fit really well with a 15th century BC altar underneath a later altar that was built a couple centuries later. We're kind of working on that still. The political situation is very sensitive, but you can watch that program on Digging for Truth if you're interested in learning more about that discovery. Obviously, that hits right in the middle of the book of Joshua and all the spiritual and theological meaning behind blessings and curses. I mean, that's a boatload of stuff to study. Also want to share with you another topic that I can't get into tonight, and that is our work on the excavations at Ai. That's Joshua 7 and 8. After the Israelites destroy and conquer Jericho, they go to Ai. And so my colleague, Dr. Bryant Wood, I interview him here, 2 parts on the work that we did at Ai, why we think we found the city of Ai in the book of Joshua. And then there's a 2-part interview on the book of Hatzor in northern Israel. This is another, what we call a city of destruction. There are 3 cities in Joshua that are mentioned explicitly that the Israelites destroy and set on fire: Ai, Jericho, and Hatzor. And so there's nothing like a fire in the archaeological record to correlate with a written text that says there was a fire. And so Hatzor is a great example of that, and that's a 2-part episode because we also have a campaign against Hatzor in the book of Judges in chapter 4 and 5 during the time of Deborah and Barak. So there's some interesting correlations there. So if you, again, a free resource for you to watch if you like. Now, my next talk tonight, after we take a break, I don't know if I've gone too long or not. I hope I haven't gone too long. It's like 7:30. So everybody's shaking their head no. Good. You're stuck with me. To supplement my next talk on Jericho, we also have some episodes on Jericho on our TV program, Digging for Truth, right? So you can also supplement that along with the other stuff. Now, I know that's, again, a fire hose of stuff, but I really wanted to just tell you what we have available as a ministry. And then you can freely watch it at your leisure, on your phone, during your lunch break, wherever you might want to do that. It's freely available, and we want to avail you of that because it will help supplement your study even further. The TV show, we try not to be highly technical on it, so I think even if you're not familiar with archaeology, you should be able to follow along rather easily. I hope we try to keep it that way for the greater church. And so there's a couple episodes. You just go to our YouTube page and type in Jericho, and all the Jericho stuff will come up. So those are some resources available to you. I know that was a mouthful.